This conference will now be recorded.
All right, good afternoon, folks. I'm glad that you're here. We are going to be talking about the respiratory system. I have here sharing with you all my screen. You'll see that I have respiratory notes. I'm going to be sharing these notes with you all. They will be helpful to you all. You're not going to have to, you're not in the anatomy class, so you're not having to process and memorize all the information on here, but I believe that these notes can be helpful to you all as far as some understanding regarding the respiratory system. So this is why I will post them in documents and resources. Again, you won't have to, really what you'll be responsible for will be in the PowerPoint presentation. But this, I believe, can help a little bit as far as there's some information that definitely crosses over from the notes to the PowerPoint, and that's why I'm going to provide them for you all. Okay, and I want to go over a couple things with you all as far as understanding that when we're thinking of the respiratory system and what takes place as far as air enters in and out of our bodies, there's processes that occur. Okay, and I want you to have an understanding of terms and terminology as you're thinking about this system here. When we think of the act of breathing, air entering in and out of our body, right, and in and out of our lungs, the respiratory system, breathing, right, the proper medical term that we would use and an anatomical term that we would use as far as a description of that would be pulmonary ventilation. Okay, so pulmonary ventilation is the act of breathing, and gas exchange is occurring as a result of this. Now, as far as ventilation is concerned, it's just the movement of air in and out of the lungs. Actual, what's called external and internal respiration, very important as far as understanding that. In external respiration, there's an actual exchange, like I mentioned just a moment ago, an exchange of the gases that we're taking into our body and an exchange between what's taking place within the lungs and interacting with the cardiovascular system. Okay, and this takes place in what's called a structure called the alveoli that we'll be talking about in a bit. So oxygen will be put into the blood and carried by the erythrocytes, primarily the red blood cells. So you see their gas transport, and then it's going to go to the cells and the tissues of the body via being transported via the blood and throughout all the blood vessels that are covering our whole body. And know that really this gas exchange, it's taking place then not only just in the lungs there as far as the alveoli, but also at the tissue level and going to the cellular and tissue level via the capillaries, those very tiny little blood vessels. Okay? You'll see here where it says, then you'll see external respiration, I mentioned that, between the lungs and the blood. Then how about internal respiration is where the exchange is taking place, another gas exchange between the blood and the cells, okay, the cells of those tissues, okay, at the and the capillaries, those very tiny, fine little blood vessels that are thin-walled and allow for gas to exit and enter, okay, as far as oxygen to exit, CO2 to enter, and also nutrients also, but we're talking about the respiratory system this week. We'll be talking about digestive system very soon, okay, following this chapter here. So that I want you to know those terms, because I'm sure when you just think respiration, you know, you have to realize that there's this external and internal respiration and what's taking place as far as the exchange of these gases. And then again, this ventilation, realizing that that represents breathing. Okay, I want to show you this also. I like this image, and so it's in my notes, and so that's why I share it with you all. As far as know that, volume and pressure, okay? So volume, you'll see here, here's the volume of a container. Here's the volume of this container that's being filled, because you see here that the volume has been compressed. So it's smaller volume on the right in comparison to the left, right? So if we're able to, with these structures right here, adjust the volume, we would say that the higher volume here has a lesser pressure, right? The pressure is decreased. So as volume increases, pressure decreases. It's inversely proportional. One goes in one direction, the other goes in the other direction, okay? As far as the value is concerned. Here you'll see that the volume, if the volume decreases, if we make a smaller volume, we're going to have a higher pressure. So volume decreases, pressure increases. So you can see that they're inversely proportional, we would say. Okay. And it's actually, we call it a law. It's a Boyle's law. It's something that this happens. It's not just something, well, maybe it happens. No, it happens, and that's why we'd call it an actual law present within the biological sciences and such. So as a result, think of now. So I've just shown you these this image here, and it's just a container. But how about if we say the lungs, right? The lungs, when we inhale, right, we actually increase the volume in our thoracic cavity, right? And as a result, the pressure decreases, okay? So as we inhale, right, we're able to have a higher volume but lesser pressure. And what happens then is that the pressure, the atmospheric pressure that's outside of our bodies is greater than the pressure that's within our lungs. So air will then enter into our bodies. Okay. So it's not, we don't have to do that, right? It's just a matter of that if we are able to increase the volume in our lungs, in our thoracic cavity, in the lungs, that volume will increase, the pressure will decrease, the pressure is going to be less than the pressure in the atmosphere, and as a result, air will enter into our bodies. Now, you can understand that you can forcibly take air into your body, okay? But you don't necessarily have to just, suck in the air, so to speak. By you just increasing the volume of your chest, you're able to then decrease the pressure within your body, less than the pressure outside of your body, and air will just naturally enter in, going from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And now if that happens, understand that the opposite is also true, that as volume decreases, so as the volume in our chest and in the lungs decreases, the pressure will increase and it'll force the air out of our bodies, out of our lungs, and into the atmosphere. So the pressure within will be greater than the pressure in the atmosphere. That's an important concept to understand regarding the respiratory system, because this is how gases move. Again, can we forcibly exhale? I think of I'm a comic book guy, so I think of like Superman with his super breath, right? Breathing out cold breath or whatever kind of thing. But understand that you can actually forcibly exhale. Definitely that occurs, but really you don't have to. As long as you're just involved in this normal ventilation, pulmonary ventilation, this breathing in and out, you're able to just change the pressure inside of your body that will in turn allow for air to actually enter in or go out as a result of pressure changes. Okay, so very important to get that concept and to know that this structure right here, the alveoli, these are air sacs. This is where the gas exchange takes place between the lungs and the cardiovascular system, the tiny capillaries that actually surround these air sacs. Let's see if I have a picture on here. If not, then we're going to be going right over to the, okay, we will look at that. All right, I'm going to show you one last picture in just a moment here, because I think this will help. But we're going to go to the PowerPoint in just a moment, and then you'll see images of the lungs and of the alveoli and those air sacs that have covering of capillaries, and that's where that external respiration takes place. Now, here's just giving you another image, and again, I will share these notes with you all, that shows you how whether the atmospheric pressure, the air outside of our bodies, is actually higher or lower than what takes place within our bodies. You'll see here that the atmospheric pressure, the air, is 760 millimeters of mercury. Well, when there is a pressure within the lungs of 761, right, it's not a lot of a difference, only a little bit of a difference, because the pressure is higher because the volume is smaller. You see how the volume here in comparison to here, volume is smaller on the image that you're viewing on your left. So the pressure is greater, and it's greater than the atmospheric pressure outside, 761 in comparison to 760. So air exits the body. Here we have Larger volume, less pressure. The pressure is a little bit less, 1 millimeter of mercury less than in the atmospheric pressure, so air will naturally enter into the lungs. Okay, that's an important concept. So I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to go to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just see if there's any questions or anybody comments. Any questions or comments? So it's kind of a weird concept, to be honest. I have to tell you that. You know, this whole pressure changes and such. But as a result of this changes in the pressure, that's how air is going to move in and out of our body, just without much effort. Understood? Okay. Now, again, we will see and we'll talk about some pathology, come diseases, disorders, come the Thursday, okay? And I'll give assignments on Thursday, that kind of thing, and talk about different anatomical structures, but we'll wait until Thursday for that. So are there any questions or comments right now? Good? Okay, all right. I'll hide everyone and continue sharing and looking at the PowerPoint. Okay, so the respiratory system, it's a system of gas exchange, and that's very important. So really, like I mentioned before there with the notes, and again, I'll still post them after class today, talking about pulmonary ventilation, just air entering in and out of our bodies, the gas exchange, external and internal respiration, dealing with this exchange of these gases with the tissues of our body and how we get it to, so first initially present within the lungs. That gas exchange takes place with the lungs and the blood vessels and the blood, right? Those capillaries, the blood. And then we have, then the blood is carrying this oxygen to the tissue, the cells and the tissues of the body, and internal respiration will take place and an exchange will take place, right? So the lungs, those airways, those tubes, very important in order to have air pass in and out of the respiratory system. The epiglottis is an important structure. It's a flap. I kind of think, I know it's kind of weird, but I kind of think of it like a toilet bowl covering, seat covering, right? Think about that, right? It's this covering that prevents movement of material from one area to another. So in the case of the epiglottis, it's preventing gas from entering into, really, it's preventing of food and liquid from entering into the respiratory system. Food and liquid entering into the respiratory system, if it gets stuck in there, that can cause infection and be a major problem. You've heard of people aspirating fluids if they go unconscious and maybe they vomit, or they're just not able to properly breathe, and they could get fluid present within pneumonia, right? So fluids that are present and causing an infection and preventing gas exchange, this is a problem. So the epiglottis will help to prevent fluid and food from entering into the respiratory system. The trachea, also known as the windpipe, right? This is the tube that will allow for only gases to pass into the lungs. The vocal cords are present in what's called the larynx, and the vocal cords actually will be able to allow for air to pass through them and cause sounds, right? So we call this phonation. This is speech. And I'm going to, on Thursday, I'll share with you a cool video regarding singing and vocal cords and watching how they work. It's pretty wild, and how air will pass through those structures and will vibrate and cause sounds. And it's pretty neat. So here you're seeing, as far as we look at the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, this is your tongue right there. We have the pharynx, this is your throat. Here's the epiglottis right here, and here we have the trachea. And we have the tubes, the bronchi and the bronchioles, the very tiny structures that are tubes that allow for then air to pass through. And really where we're wanting to go is to these structures right here, these alveoli. These little sacs. These little sacs are thin-walled sacs that will allow for then this gas exchange to occur. So you'll see here the capillaries are covering all these sacs and will allow for oxygen and CO2, carbon dioxide, to go past between them and allow for then the blood to be oxygenated, and then we let go of the CO2, and that's let go of and sent out of the body via exhalation, expiration. Okay, exhaling it out of the body and getting rid of it. Now, the lungs are cone-shaped organs, and so look at this for a moment here. You'll see that in comparison to the heart would rest right in through in here, right in through in here, and you'll see that the lungs have a peak that is superiorward, right? Superiorward, and at the base it's wide. Okay, inferiorward, the base, it's wide. So narrow at the top, the superior aspect, wider at the base, at the inferior aspect. It's opposite of what the heart is. The heart has an apex that is inferiorward, and a base would be superiorward. So we'll see that. You've seen that already as far as the heart is concerned. So the lungs are opposite as far as their shape is concerned, right? And cone-shaped organs located above the diaphragm. That's a very powerful, strong muscle. When that muscle contracts, it goes from this to this. When the diaphragm contracts, it flattens. So it's like this, like a dome-shaped muscle that when it contracts, it flattens. And when it flattens, it actually will help to increase the volume of the lungs, which will in turn decrease the pressure and allow for air to then enter directly from the atmosphere into our bodies. This is important as far as seeing there that gas exchange occurs within the lungs, very important, as well as at the tissue level. So this gas exchange occurs in the lungs would be external respiration. Gas exchange that takes place within the cells and the tissues, internal respiration. And of note here, you see that they're soft, spongy, have elasticity, so they're able to expand and contract. They're able to get larger and then go back to return to their smaller initial size. They're covered in a thin membrane called the pleura. So when there's an inflammation to the pleura, to the covering, we would say it's pleuritis, right? And that's a very uncomfortable and could be life-threatening if not treated. And here we're seeing as far as, this is neat, these cilia. These cilia will have mucus present on them, and they'll be able to attract any type of particulate matter that enters into our lungs, and we'll be able to filter it out and move it out and get caught in the mucus, the sticky mucus, so it doesn't stay and enter within the lung. Here's the vocal cords, which is pretty wild stuff as far as how air passes through the opening, the glottis, and this allows for then vibration of these cords, which allows for us to produce speech. And you'll see that really, here's your tongue, that's the tip of your tongue. So here would be the base of your tongue, and then here would be the structures that would be the larynx, we would call it, which is your voice box. You've probably heard, I'm sure, the term voice box before. Again, these terms here that I've gone over as far as respiration is concerned, right? So the delivery of oxygen from the air to body cells, and we know that there's like the external and the internal respiration, and we're able to then also remove the CO2, the waste gas, from the body. Okay? And we know that it moves as a result of also, just as we have this pressure gradient with the atmosphere and inside and our bodies, what's going on within our lungs, well, there's also at the tissue level, at the cellular level, there's also this pressure gradient, so that if there's high pressure within the blood cells that are they're oxygen rich, right? They're carrying a lot of blood cells that have a lot of oxygen, and they go to the cells, and the cells have low levels of oxygen. It's going to go from high concentration to low concentration. The blood to the cells, because the cells have low levels of oxygen. So that oxygen will move from high to low, okay? It'll diffuse, we would say. So diffusion, it's movement from high to low. So that's what's taking place with. And then the opposite would take place between CO2, carbon dioxide, at the cellular level, high levels of CO2. We're going to get rid of that waste gas, and we're going to then take on the oxygen. Okay? So high levels at the cells of CO2, going from high levels to low levels within the blood, And so then this is why we have the CO2 moving from the cells into the blood so that it can be released in the lungs and out of our bodies. Okay? And know that cellular respiration takes place within the mitochondria. You'll see here the mitochondria of this cell, this body cell, and know that the mitochondria, they are producing then ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is the energy currency of the body that the body needs in order to produce and power reactions throughout the body. Okay. Okay. So the conditions of the gas exchange. Okay, factors that are influencing this gas exchange. Well, really, the surface area of the lung alveoli. So there are different types of disease and disorder processes that will occur that will damage the walls of the alveoli. So let me go back here for a moment. There we go. So you'll see here that there are many of these little oval shaped structures, these alveoli, right? And this is where gas exchange takes place. Well, in the case of, say, emphysema, right? You might have heard that term. There'll be breaking down or destruction of the walls of these alveoli. So there'll be larger spaces and less surface area for gas exchange to occur. And that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. So that doesn't help the patient. It actually really makes it very difficult for the patient to have gas exchange. And it's really quite a problem indeed. Let's see here, as far as so that the pressure gradient, so meaning that there's a higher pressure one area and a lower pressure in another area, right? So that's a gradient. There's a difference between, and we know that the gases will move from high concentration to low concentration. That's important for you to know. Movement from high to low. So let's take a look at this right here. So we'll see that. So cells of the respiratory surface exchange gases with both external and internal environment. So here we go. As far as the external environment, we have here cells of the respiratory surface, right? And we're going to have then oxygen will enter into the cells and CO2 will exit out. And again, CO2 is going to enter into the lungs and be exhaled, right? And then we're going to then have interaction then between the actual cardiovascular system, movement of the gases then to the body cells. So passing through the respiratory surface into the blood, and then from the blood into the cells. I'm sorry, I don't want to confuse you all. This is in the lungs, the alveoli. We're having this movement of material, of these gases through the cells and into the blood. Okay, that's important to know that the blood is going to be the vehicle to transport these gases, whether they be oxygen or CO2, and take them oxygen to the cells and then remove CO2, which will then in turn go to the external environment. It's a little bit of a tricky type of an image. I'm sorry if it confuses you, I apologize. Here we have, as far as this is pretty neat, and looking at this image here to see that there are many tiny channels and tubes that will be connected to the alveoli, those little sacs, that will allow for gas exchange to occur. So look at all the area, folks, that all of that gas exchange will connect to these alveoli and allow for gas exchange to occur. Quite remarkable. Now here's something interesting, and this is going over as far as move this. I want to move something here for a moment. Yeah. So breathing at high altitude and underwater. So know that at high altitudes there are lower levels of oxygen. Okay. So the partial pressure of oxygen decreases as elevation increases. So if you get to a high elevation on a mountain, right, you're going to have less available oxygen in the atmosphere. And know that the air that we breathe, it's only a small percentage of oxygen. Primarily, it's a higher percentage of in the 70 percentile. Sorry, I don't memorize the actual percentages. I can get that for you. But it's like 70% or so of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, and only about 20 some odd percent would be oxygen. Yeah, which is wild, right? But it's how it's at the right percentage that to help us to breathe. But if you go to a high altitude, you need to acclimate and get used to be at a high altitude because you can get what's called altitude sickness. There's a proper term for it. I'm not thinking about it, but when you're at a higher elevation, high altitude, lower oxygen is present, and you could get nausea and headaches and other issues until your body gets acclimated to the higher elevation and the lower level of oxygen. Yeah. And so people who are going to events, say like Mexico City. Mexico City is at a high elevation, and if an athlete were to have to go at some type of event like track and field, something like that, and they're going Olympics, and they're going to have to compete in a place like Mexico City, which a higher elevation but lower oxygen levels, they would actually move to an area of high elevation to train their bodies to get used to functioning and competing at that higher elevation so that they would do well and that they wouldn't do poorly in comparison to other countries that maybe are just naturally at a higher elevation and are the competitors are used to training at that higher elevation with lower oxygen levels. Quite interesting stuff. Yeah. The term hypoxic just means that there's this shortage of oxygen. Okay, and so hypoxia can be a very bad thing. It's not a positive thing, but again, you can train and get used to this as far as these lower levels of oxygen if you acclimate yourself. But underwater, this is an issue where you're continually having to deal with this. I've enjoyed. I spent 6 years in the military. Um, I was a cook in the Coast Guard, and nothing glamorous or anything like that, a real tough thing. But I served the country, and and I'm always fascinated with these people who are involved in special forces, in particular the Navy SEALs, and pretty neat stuff. And I've actually had opportunity to talk with Navy SEALs, and pretty cool stuff actually. But know that with the Navy SEALs, they train and do a lot of work in the water and underwater. And so they have to train themselves in order to get used to functioning at lower oxygen levels. So that during BUDS, it's like this initial basic training for Navy SEALs, that they actually go through like underwater training that just for most of us it would just freak us out and we'd fail because it's so difficult what they do. But and I grew up in the water. I mean, I went to the Coast Guard. I love the water. I love the beach. Been in the water all my life since I was a little kid, and yet like at the levels that they're training at, it's just crazy, and how they're able to function on very little oxygen for very long periods of time. It's quite cool. So training can be useful in that.
Professor, I have a question.
Sure.
If you were, let's say you were going to run a marathon, would it make sense for you to train at high altitudes and then go into like a lower altitude for the marathon?
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, understood. So I do believe that is a school of thought, and that there are athletes that would do that kind of a thing. I don't know. To be honest, I'm sorry that as far as like I can't give you a whole lot of information regarding that. But yeah, in theory, that kind of makes some sense, and that you're learning to work on less than what normally be acceptable and available, and so that would make some sense that it could be beneficial to the athlete. Know that do you recall when we talked about doping in talking about the blood and how they would if so say like in the Tour de France, right? Tour de France, they're in the mountains and such on bikes, and they're at crazy elevations. Well, how did they get around it? Well, they cheated, and many of them do. So it's not just one group in particular, but they would actually do this blood doping where they'd donate their own blood, wait until time of competition, infuse it into their bodies so they'd have a higher level of red blood cells, erythrocytes, and then as a result, they'd have better availability for gas exchange and carrying of oxygen, even at the higher elevations. But again, too, that's
I guess
illegal.
technically they didn't break any rules. It's their blood.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because unfortunately, right? Yeah, they did because they're told that they can't do that. But I know it's yeah, I understand. Yeah, wild. But yep, there's rules, and you got to follow the rules if you want to, you know, be ethical and moral as far as what you're doing. So, all right, let me hide everyone. We'll go back to sharing my screen and finish out the PowerPoint. Let's see where we're at right at the moment here. Yeah, we're like about halfway through. So, I don't know. Does anybody dive at all? Any of you dive? You can just say out loud. It's okay. Anybody do any diving at all? So I don't, but I do think it's fascinating. I think I would like to try it sometime. Nitrogen narcosis. So I said to you, recall that I said that nitrogen is a good percentage of the air that we're breathing. So increasing pressure, like so when they have tanks that they're wearing that are pressurized, right? Increasing pressure can cause nitrogen gas to dissolve in tissue fluid and move into cells. And so this can be an issue where it can cause a euphoria and a drowsiness, and this could be a dangerous thing. If a diver rises too quickly, we can also have an issue where then falling pressure causes nitrogen to enter the blood faster than it can be exhaled. These bubbles can form in the blood and in tissues, and this can cause the bends, and this can be quite a severe and bad problem. Know that there's a training exercise that the Navy SEALs do where they have this very deep tube of water. So it's like a pool, but it's a really deep pool, right? And at intervals, I don't recall, maybe it's like 10 feet, 12 feet, there are bubbles of air. Kind of interesting, right? So let me draw something here. So it's kind of like this, where and what'll happen is that, so if you see, like, it kind of looks weird, right? But it's like there's these bubbles of air inside of this tube of water, right? This pool, and it's a deep pool. And what'll happen is that the SEALs will, with no gear, right? There'll be people that'll be there for protection, as far as instructors that'll have the diving gear. But the students that are being tested have no gear. They just dive into the water, and they'll go from area of air to area of air to area of air, and they'll go very deep into the water. Then what they have to do is, without any gear, they hold their breath until they get to those areas of air. They'll go back into the water and then try to ascend, right? But they have to ascend at a rate where they're breathing out a little bit of air from their lungs in the water, and they're not rising quicker than their bubbles that are leaving their that they're exiting their body, right, by their exhalation. Just a little bit of, letting a little bit of air out at a time. They don't rise any quicker because they're trying to prevent this decompression sickness. Yeah, pretty wild stuff. Interesting. So the respiratory cycle, right? So we call this pulmonary ventilation, and it's air entering and exiting from our lungs, our respiratory system, and we would call this breathing. Okay, and so inspiration, right? Inspiration is a term we use for air entering into our bodies. Expiration, air going out of. Excuse me. Get a drink. All right. Now, know that with inspiration or inhalation, we can also use that term. Let me put that on here so that this way, to inhale, right? So inhalation. Exhalation. Okay. All right. So with inspiration, we have contraction of the diaphragm and contraction of the external intercostal muscles. So these two muscles here, and the intercostals are between the ribs, okay? Intercostal, between the ribs, those muscles. So the diaphragm and the external intercostals, they contract in order to increase the volume of our chest, which in turn will decrease the pressure, which in turn will allow what? Air to enter into our bodies. Expiration, also known as exhalation, air exiting our bodies. This can be passive. Passive meaning, let me write that down too. Passive, no muscle contraction takes place. Okay. So no muscle contraction for passive expiration, exhalation. That's normally what takes place. That the muscles just relax, the volume becomes smaller, the pressure gets greater, and then that pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure, and so air is exiting out of our bodies. That's passive. Active, active would be this. That's active exhalation, expiration, where we're forcefully contracting and pushing air out of the respiratory system. Here you're just seeing, this is neat regarding inhalation and exhalation as far as someone who's swimming. And I said to you that it's a matter of this pressure gradient, this difference between pressures within the lungs and outside of the lungs. Okay, that's important for you to know. And the actual, we would call this the volume of air in a breath, right? Approximately 500 milliliters of air. This is the tidal volume. So just as the tide, think about this when you're at the beach. The tide goes out, goes in, out and in, right? There's this pattern, right, that's taking place in and out. Well, tidal volume, as far as also, this is like just how breathing is taking place within pulmonary ventilation, breathing for the respiratory system. And you'll see here that there are multiple types of, we would say, volumes and capacities as far as how when air is exchanging and entering into, because we can have this, you'll see here the tidal volume, this is just the amount that's entering in and out, okay? All right, that would be right here, okay? But there are inspiration reserves, there are expiration reserves, the total, know this, I want you to know this, total volume, the tidal volume, T-I-D-A-L, tidal volume, is just that 500 milliliters entering and exiting the body, right, the respiratory system. The total lung capacity, this is the ability for you to have the amount of inspiration and expiration, and then the residual, there's a reserve that you never really can totally let out, that's present within the respiratory system within the lungs. I don't really want you to know, memorize, or commit to memory or anything else from that, okay? Now, and you can just state, say something and turn on your mic if you'd like. You don't have to. But has anybody ever had to help someone that was choking? Has anybody ever had to do the Heimlich maneuver at all, or do some pats on the chest, on the back of the chest?
I've actually had to do the Heimlich maneuver.
Okay. What was it like to do it? Was it scary?
Yeah, a little bit, but at the time I was also CPR certified, so I kind of knew what I was doing. But
Good.
Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, someone's life is in the balance here, because if air is being blocked as a result of someone who is legitimately choking, right? The universal sign would be this, right? We're choking. Okay. And really, will anything come out? Can they make any noise? Really, they can't talk if they're choking. If they're legitimately choking and there's a blockage, they can't talk. If they can talk, then encourage the person to cough. Encourage them to cough and try and cough it out. But if they cannot, then we can do the Heimlich maneuver, where you take your one hand and you have your thumb like this, and you put it right below in the sternum here. There's an area called the xiphoid process, and you can actually palpate that and feel that. If you go right below, you take the other hand, back it up, back the one hand that's pushing in, and you push in and up, and the person is in front of you, and you're doing that very quickly there, you're able to help to force the air through the respiratory system and push whatever is blocking present within their airway. And this can absolutely work. You could actually do this to yourself using a chair if necessary, if you're by yourself. Here we go. As far as so back blows, having the person lean forward, like I said before there, just using the heel and smacking them between the shoulder blades to see if you can help them to dislodge it, and then doing the abdominal thrust of the Heimlich maneuver in order to also help dislodge whatever is blocking their airway. Very important to know this.
I had to do it to my baby sister when she was, I think she was like 6 months. I had to do it to her because I remember in health class how to do it to like a baby.
Yes, yeah. So
it was terrifying.
Yeah, that is indeed, yeah. So to be able to hold them, to really have them rest in the what's called the prone position on their tummies, on your one arm, and then you're to smack them on the back, having them kind of leaning inferiorward, downward as you smack them on the back, trying to help them to dislodge. Very scary indeed. And then you can try and also like put your finger in their mouth and try and dislodge what might be causing the problem. Yeah, indeed, please. With kids choking, so like giving a little one, a young child, like hot dogs, and hot dogs are absolutely, and even in like nursing homes and such, and elderly patients, hot dogs are really, as much as they're fun to eat, they don't crunch down, they don't smush real easy, and so they can, if they take too big of a bite, they can get lodged within the airway, and this can be a problem. Yeah, well, good for you that you were, and thank you for giving your input as far as doing the Heimlich maneuver and helping someone who's choking. Scary stuff, but you know what? In cases of time of need, you don't allow that to get you. You act, so that someone can survive and live. And yeah, afterwards, then you can decompress and get a little scared and be like, whoa, what just happened? But yeah. Good stuff, though. That's wonderful. Thank you for doing what you did. That's wonderful stuff. So here's just a review as far as what we've been talking about, as far as internal and external respiration. The alveoli, those structures that allow for this gas exchange to occur, they have a very thin membrane, this very thin membrane that allows for the gases to go in and pass through in order then to go from the lungs to the blood, then from the blood to the, and then for external respiration, for internal respiration, for then the gas to go from the blood to the cells and then into the tissues. The hemoglobin, very important, right? This protein, extremely important. So I think I've mentioned to you all that when we think of a red blood cell, we think of a sac. It's really a sac of hemoglobin. It's just, there's no nucleus. Remember, red blood cells have no nucleus, and they just have this protein, hemoglobin, that's present in order to readily take on oxygen and then let it go when it reaches the cells of the body. Okay, so taking on the oxygen in the lungs and then releasing it into the when it gets to the systemic circulation and to the cells of the body. Know that we call that oxygen that has then connected with and interacted with the hemoglobin, we call this, well, we call the hemoglobin oxyhemoglobin. Makes sense, right? And know that when carbon dioxide, smaller percentage can interact with the hemoglobin, we would call that carbaminohemoglobin. Don't worry about that. But the oxyhemoglobin, you should know that, please. So here what we're looking at is an image of the alveoli, these oval structures, and we're seeing how that we have these little oval structures. They're covered in these capillaries that will allow for this gas exchange to occur between the blood and these little alveoli. And you'll see here that there are holes here. These holes are just the connections between the other alveoli. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And you'll see that there are blood vessels, because you can see the actual blood cells, the erythrocytes, that are present in those areas that are covering these alveoli. Okay? And you'll see here that we have then gas exchange taking place through this thin membrane of the alveoli. So CO2, so whereas we're looking at like a very high percentage as far as oxygen then entering into the hemoglobin and being carried by the hemoglobin, only about 23% will actually bind to the hemoglobin of a red blood cell. See that carbaminohemoglobin. The rest of it's going to be present within the plasma, okay, and traveling in the plasma as CO2 and also as bicarbonate, okay. And so this can be reversed when it gets to then the area of the lungs where we then need to release the CO2. This bicarbonate will then interact with the red blood cell and become CO2 and exit into the lungs, as well as what's already present in the red blood cell, this 23%. So, you know, we're releasing it when it gets to the lungs, the CO2, the alveoli. And this is just showing you as far as the pressures and how the different pressures present depending upon where you're at in the body, where you're at in this systemic circulation and this pulmonary circulation with the lungs, systemic circulation with the body. And it's just giving you just the pressures and knowing that we're always moving from high pressure to low pressure, okay? Don't memorize terms or numbers, but just know that it's movement of pressure from high pressure to low pressure. That's how the pressure is moving. And so when we get to, so look over here, this I do want you to just have an understanding. So know that in the alveoli, right? The alveoli, those sacs, they have high concentration of oxygen, right? They're going to go to, then that oxygen will move to the capillaries, which has a low pressure and concentration of oxygen. So what's going on? We're moving from high concentration to low concentration, high pressure to low pressure, right? High pressure within the lungs, the alveolar sacs, to low pressure within the capillaries. Then we're going to have the CO2 will be at a higher pressure in the blood and go into the lung, those alveolar sacs, that has a lower pressure. Okay? So that's that external respiration. Internal respiration, here at the body cells, right, the cells of the tissues, the high pressure concentration of oxygen is present within the blood. It's going to move to the cells that has a low pressure, a low concentration present, and opposite as far as for the CO2. Okay, we have a few more slides to go and then we'll be done for the day as far as the PowerPoint. So look at this here, and we will talk about pathology and disorders and such, disease, in the lab this week. Okay? So respiratory center in the brainstem's medulla. So the medulla oblongata, it's at the brainstem, and this would be the area where your control over breathing, we'd say respiration, we would say your blood pressure, your heart rate, all vitally controlled by the medulla oblongata, a portion of the brainstem. CO2, carbon dioxide, is see how it says it's the main trigger that controls breathing rate and depth, meaning that it's not your high levels of oxygen or low levels of oxygen that trigger you to breathe. Okay, so get an example. I'm in the water and I dive into the water and I want to hold my breath, right? Hold my breath. Hold my breath. I'm underwater. And as I'm underwater for a period of time holding my breath, it's not the levels of oxygen that are decreasing that gives me the desire that I want to go out and breathe. I want to get up out of the water and breathe. No, it's the increased levels of CO2 building up within my body that are actually the trigger that's making my body and medulla oblongata telling, hey, we need to get up and out of into the air and the atmosphere, out of the water in order to breathe and get more oxygen. So it's CO2 and not oxygen that would be the trigger. Okay, so which would be, for most of us, we would think it would be oxygen, low levels of oxygen, but no, it's high levels of CO2 that are causing us to want to breathe. And you could do this even just on land, right? You just hold your breath, and over a period of time, your body's going to want to breathe, not because of the low levels of oxygen, but because of the high levels of CO2 that are building up within your body. Okay. And this is just showing you an example where the connection between the nervous system and the respiratory system. So you'll see here, so other controls help match airflow. So homeostasis, right? The stable environment within our body. So when we think of stability and homeostasis, we think of the gas levels in particular, but there's also other areas of the body that can be affected as a result of your respiration. Only minor aspects of breathing are under conscious control, right? So you know that, like I said, you're just sitting here right now. You can forcibly inhale and exhale, conscious control, right? Voluntary. But primarily, your body is under an involuntary control that it's doing it automatically, right? And so that the nervous system is helping to maintain that and control that. You're not always consciously thinking, I need to breathe. Okay, right? You're not. That's not taking place. The body, the brain, the nervous system is overriding that and controlling that. And this just gives you an idea as far as that there are receptors within the body, within the cardiovascular system, that are acknowledging and registering the levels of oxygen and CO2, and then being able to then send it back to the brain, in particular to the brainstem. So you're seeing here, this is the medulla oblongata. So the cerebellum, the pons, the midbrain. Here's the brainstem right here, the medulla oblongata. This would be then the spinal cord. This is that important area that's controlling your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, your heart rate. Very, very important. All right, so I'm going to then hold off on discussing the remainder of this PowerPoint until the lab. So there's a few slides that I want to review with you all on Thursday and talking about respiratory system disorders. And I've already mentioned a few things here, but we'll get into more detail on the Thursday lecture, Thursday lab.